could be.
Latest news: the big picture. Today's hot photos. Meghan Markle beats Kate Middleton for most influential fashion star of the year. Sweet treats, turkey and TV. Here's what Meghan Markle can expect from her first Christmas with the royals. Hilton archive. Getty Images. King Edward VII's reign began on January 20, 1936. Less than 12 months later, England had a new king. Regardless of how fascinated people would become by Princess Diana decades later, or how heated royal baby fever can get to this day, it was Edward's decision to give up his throne for love 81 years ago that entirely altered the course of the monarchy. Many might wonder why he couldn't do as he darn well pleased, considering he was the literal king of England. Quite possibly, if a similar scenario presented itself now, perhaps it would go a different way. But back then, the United Kingdom's sovereign monarch marrying a twice-divorced American woman just wouldn't do it all, let alone a woman who actually wasn't even divorced from her second husband yet when the king fell in love with her. Bessie Wallis Warfield was born June 19, 1896, at the Monterey Inn, the biggest hotel in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, and a popular summer vacation spot for folks from nearby Baltimore, where the family lived. Her father, Tico Wallis Warfield, son of a flour merchant who was known as one of the most popular citizens of Baltimore, died that November of tuberculosis, after which the child and her mother, Alice Montague, moved in with a widowed aunt. Montague married her second husband, John Freeman Rosine, in 1908, and at some point in her youth, Wallis dropped the Bessie Solomon Warfield, an uncle on her father's side, financed Wallis' education at Oldfields, a Maryland finishing school, but, according to Anne Sebas, that were in the life of Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, his refusal to pay for a coming-out ball for his niece sent her scurrying to Florida to visit a cousin. Keystone Hilton archive. Getty Images. It was in Pensacola, Florida, that she met Navy pilot Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., known familiarly as Win Spencer, in April 1916. He would become her husband on November 8, 1916, but his military duty ensured that they spent a lot of time apart. Wallis, who was never considered a great beauty but who by all accounts had charm to spare, hypnotic eyes and a fiery magnetism that proved irresistible to men from all walks of life, reportedly kept busy while her husband was away. Mrs. Spencer was infamous for arousing bouts of passion among adoring males. A friend, Diana Angulo, said about Wallis, according to Seba, "Through the years I think men found her witty, and that special ability of giving them her full attention. Quite an art. I think men were more generous and complimentary than women." Among her rumored extramarital paramours were Argentine diplomat Felipe d'Espile and Count Galeazzo Ciano, an Italian aristocrat 7 years her junior, whom she met in China while her husband was stationed there. Ciano would go on to marry Mussolini's daughter, Etta, and he was executed by an anti-fascist firing squad in 1944. Etta would later deny it, but the big rumor of the day was that Ciano got Wallis pregnant and a botched abortion left her infertile. What people do know was that Wallis got sick in 1925 while on a trans-Pacific Ocean liner traveling from Japan to Seattle. Upon arrival in Seattle, she underwent an undisclosed operation that later was wildly speculated to be anything from the abortion in question to a complication from being born with male sex organs. While still recovering from the surgery, she boarded a train to take her back to Washington, D.C. Spencer met her in Chicago and dropped her off with her mother, by then married to her third husband. In D.C., Hilton Deutsch Collection. Corpus via Getty Images. Wallis and Spencer divorced in 1927, but while she was waiting for that to be finalized, she found out her uncle Saul Warfield had died, and, upset that she was getting divorced, had left her only $15,000, a paltry sum, compared to the $5 million she thought she was going to inherit. While figuring out her next move, she searched her friends' guest quarters in New York and Pennsylvania, at one point even considering a career in steel scaffolding sales. While staying with an old school chum in New York, she met Mr. and Mrs. Ernest Simpson, who had been married since 1923 and had one daughter. At some point over friendly bridge games and trips to art galleries and museums, Simpson, who was 1 year younger, fell for Wallis and asked if he could marry her as soon as they were both officially divorced. They married on July 21, 1928. Simpson had been born in New York to British parents, and he and Wallis soon moved to England. A high society friend, Simpson's sister, had married a prominent politician and lived in a stylish flat where Mrs. Simpson liked to entertain. Meanwhile, Wallis had decided, ultimate goal unknown, that she would meet the Prince of Wales, aka Prince Edward, son of King George V and Queen Mary, next in line to the British throne. Wallis did meet the prince in 1931 through her friend Thelma Furness, who happened to be one of Edward's girlfriends at the time. Rykoff Collection Getty Images. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David wasn't considered much of an intellectual, nor, at 57, did he cut a powerful figure, but he was said to be quick-witted and free-spirited. A distant, antagonistic relationship with his father may have contributed to that. He was also quite the libertine, though girlfriends were said to refer to him as the little man. He was very fair-faced and only required a shave once a week. He was also, according to certain analyses of his correspondence and reported behavior, anywhere from crazy or deeply disturbed to on the autism spectrum. At 20 years old he joined the British Army's Guards when World War I broke out, in 1914. In 1918 he embarked on an affair with 28-year-old Frida Dudley Ward and, despite her being married, she became Edward's main squeeze for the next 16 years. He had other squeezes, as did she, but Frida was his main one. Each day I long more and more to chuck this job and be out of it and free for you, sweetie, Edward wrote to Frida in 1920 during a 7-month tour of Australia and New Zealand, this job apparently being his royal duties. The more I think of it all, the more certain I am that really the day for kings and princes is past. Monarchies are out of date, though I know it is a rotten thing for me to say, and again, he had no trouble attracting women. Wallis Simpson biographer Hugo Vickers told NPR in 2011 that he was of the opinion that, though she married Prince Albert in 1923, Queen Elizabeth II's mother was actually in love with Edward, and that's why she resented Simpson. She was said to have blamed the throne being thrust upon her husband for his early death at 56 in 1952. My theory is that the Queen Mother was really rather in love with the Duke of Windsor and probably would have quite liked to have married him, Vickers said. It must have passed through her mind, and I think it suited her very well to present the Duchess of Windsor as the woman who stole the king. And people rather swallowed that line. Weirdly enough, Edward was in Kenya in 1928 when he was informed that his father, the king, was close to death. Edward's brother Albert, eventually King George VI, would die while his daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth II, was in Kenya. But when Edward got the communique to come home right away, his father was ill. He dismissed it as some political ploy cooked up by the Prime Minister. Alan Tommy Lascelles, his assistant private secretary, was so outraged by the prince's behavior, he resigned when they did return to England. Biographer Hector Bolitho wrote of Edward that he was almost stubborn in his habit of turning his back upon the conventions of polite society. Instead, the prince enjoyed all things modern and American, telling Frida that princing was easier abroad. While he was still seeing Frida, he met Thelma Furness, whose twin sister was Gloria Morgan, mother of Gloria Vanderbilt and grandmother of Anderson Cooper, at a cattle show. Furness was on her second marriage, to a much older man, and she became the prince's second mistress. Edward had no real responsibilities, as far as he could see, and 2 women who doted on him. Wallis Simpson met Thelma Furness through her friendship with Thelma's sister Consuelo, and in January 1931 Consuelo invited Wallis and Ernest Simpson to the Furnesses' home for a fox hunting weekend. Prince Edward was also on the guest list. According to Seba's book, Edward struck up a conversation about central heating in British country homes, and some remembered Wallis basically calling him out for being boring. She always had a challenging line for the prince, Wallis' friend Mary Kirk wrote in a diary entry. Wallis did write to her aunt after the weekend that it had been a treat to meet the prince in that informal setting. She wouldn't see him again until May, when Thelma threw Edward a welcome home party after he took a trip to South America. Wallis having carefully orchestrated a swift rise through the ranks, the Simpsons first had a party that included the prince to dinner at their home in early 1932, and the rest really is history. Ernest had to start traveling more for work, and Wallis took a solo trip to the US largely, Seba wrote, to prove to herself that, approaching 40 and that when Harry met Sally, in going to be 40, someday manner, she was still desirable to men. Her mission proved successful. Back in England, meanwhile, Edward, who still was keeping company with Thelma Furness, was becoming more and more smitten with her. He threw her a 37th birthday party in June 1933. She had an American Independence Day themed party for him at her home on July 4th. The prince, the Furnesses and the Simpsons all spent New Year's Eve together, and then Thelma sailed to the United States. It was then that Edward turned his full attention to Wallis. He started buying her clothes and jewelry, just as she and Ernest were starting to have trouble paying for their own lavish lifestyle. Ernest amiably went along, though it's unclear if he knew the extent of his wife's romantic involvement. even wrangling an invitation to join the exclusive Freemasons via his connection with the prince. By May 1934, Wallis was Prince Edward's only girlfriend. Universal History Archive Getty Images. Wallis had met Edward's younger brother Prince George, not to be confused with his other brother Prince Albert, who would become King George VI, on weekend outings to his home, but the prince wanted her to finally meet his parents at a party celebrating George's marriage to Princess Marina of Greece that November. King George V crossed Wallis and Ernest Simpson's names. They were still married, after all, off the guest list, but Edward somehow managed to get them invited anyway. She exchanged meaningless pleasantries with the king and queen, Wallis later said, but George V demanded that the Simpsons not be invited to any upcoming Silver Jubilee ceremonies marking his 25th year on the throne in the coming year. Prince Edward was undeterred. After Christmas he took Wallis skiing in Austria and bought her a reported £60,000 worth of jewels for New Year's. According to that woman,